welcome. Thank you very much for coming today to listen to James Campbell. And greetings, James, down the line to you in London.
Hello.
And
good morning.
Good morning. James is a highly acclaimed writer of books about the Beats, Americans in Paris, writers in Paris, and this wonderful biography of James Baldwin, the eminent American writer whose reputation is now again on the rise, having gone through various troughs, and we'll talk about that, of course. The book first came out in 1991. It's particularly pertinent to reissue it now, probably after the events of the last couple of years, with a new published interview with Norman Mailer, which again we'll talk about because James has met obviously both of these writers, which will be fascinating to hear about. So thank you very much. And perhaps maybe start with a reading to orientate us about the book, and then we'll take it from there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Robert. And good morning, everybody. I'm going to start by reading two short sections from the book. One, actually, at the very beginning of Baldwin's life, his birth, in fact, and then I'll jump forward to talk about something else. Neither of these passages is terribly long, so there's no need to panic. So this is actually the very first words of the book. I never had a childhood, James Baldwin told a French interviewer in 1974. To a journalist 10 years earlier, he proclaimed, I did not have any human identity. To his French interviewer, he added, for good measure, I was born dead. He was, in fact, born in the Harlem Hospital at 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, New York City, on August 2nd, 1924. Illegitimate, James Arthur to Emma Burgess Jones. She was not yet 20 years old and lately arrived in New York City from Deals Island, Maryland, caught in the northward drift which was sweeping thousands of her race and generation out of the strictly segregated southern states. Emma Burgess knew the name of her first child's father, but she would not tell her son, and he never found out. I never had a childhood means partly I never had a father. Before embarking on the story of a writer's life, it is customary to offer some discussion of his or her ancestry. But what to do about this writer's? His mother had conceived her son in sin, as she herself, a devout Christian woman, felt, and then closed the door on the subject. The name Jones, which within 3 years changed to Baldwin, which never felt properly his own, passed on to James through his mother's husband, David, who was not his father, through his father, who had been born a slave. If it was necessary to isolate a single dominating impulse driving James Baldwin's work, it would be the need to defeat the silence that lies behind slavery and his people's first forced arrival in America, the land of the free, as Baldwin never tired of ironically repeating. The voice of his ancestors echoes through his pages, filtering Black biblical rhetoric and blues and gospel lyrics through the autobiographical mode he adopts to tell his singular story, the story of all his race, again and again, from first to last. I was born, Baldwin also said, in the church, meaning not only that his mother was devout and his stepfather a preacher, but that the moral world in which he grew up was fortified and sanctioned by generations of deep believers. He learned something of the power of language in the church, in the pulpit, as a boy preacher himself. He would turn his back on his faith by the time he was 17, but although he left the church never left him. Would he have reiterated that he was born in the church if it had? The prophecy of wrath and the quest for salvation shaped his imagination, just as the vocabulary and cadence of the King James Bible and the rhetoric of the pulpit were at the heart of his literary style. Well, that's a very short introduction to James Baldwin and his origins. He was obviously a boy who grew up in Harlem in conditions of severe poverty, a family of 8 children, and a stepfather whom he did not love, to put it mildly. And that was in 1922. 1924. 40 years later, Baldwin was a very famous man indeed. His face was on the cover of Time magazine in 1963. And partly as a result of that, and partly as a result of the fact that he was perceived as a kind of spokesman for what was not yet then called African Americans, he was approached by Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and of course the brother of John F. Kennedy, to attend a meeting to discuss the racial situation. And Baldwin turned up with a group of associates, and they had rather a stormy meeting. It wasn't a success. Kennedy was not pleased. And it was as a result of this meeting that James Baldwin came to the serious attention of the FBI and its director, J. Edgar Hoover. I'm going to read again a short part about his introduction to the FBI, really. And I should just say, because it comes around at the end, he first came to the attention of the FBI merely because he signed a petition which was organized by a group called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Of course, Cuba was a big issue. And lots and lots of people signed this petition, including Baldwin. And that was enough to mark him down as a subversive. He didn't really give 2 hoots about Cuba, to be honest, but he signed the petition. And so it comes around. But anyway, here we are just after the meeting with Robert Kennedy. Following the row with Kennedy, Baldwin's name was added to the FBI's reserve index, which consisted of that category of people who, in the event of an emergency, quote, will receive priority consideration with respect to investigation and or other action following apprehension of security index subjects. So we're talking about rounding up huge numbers of people. By December 1963, however, Baldwin's status within the Bureau had risen, and he was placed on the security index itself. In a memo dated December 18th, 1964, J. Edgar Hoover informed the New York office that information on Baldwin collected by special agent so-and-so, all the names are censored in the files that we've got access to. Information on Baldwin collected by special agent so-and-so, quote, clearly depicts the subject as a dangerous individual who could be expected to commit acts inimical to the national defense and public safety of the United States at the time of an emergency. Consequently, his name is being included in the security index. Robert Kennedy, it was noted in the same file, considered him, quote, a nut. After Baldwin's name was added to the security index, along with 10,000 other Americans, that's a lot of people to round up, frequent checks were made on his home to confirm that he was continuing to reside at the address given on his file. This was usually done by means of a pretext phone call or a pretext interview. In other words, the phone would ring and somebody would ask about if you were interested in buying a car and they wanted your name and address. And it was an FBI agent. Or else by spying on his entrances and exits. from the building where he lived. On the face of it, such methods of verification would have been unnecessary had the FBI been eavesdropping on his telephone calls. But Baldwin's phone was not tapped. Even neighbors in the apartment building where Baldwin lived were unknowingly recruited as spies by the FBI. A verification of information memorandum of June 2nd, 1964, states that on a suitable pretext, so-and-so of 470 West End Avenue was interviewed concerning this individual and volunteered information re the subject. Now that's very interesting because it's a neighbor, but the neighbor didn't know he was being interviewed by an FBI agent. But that neighbor thereafter becomes, in official terms, an FBI informant. So if it happened to you that you were interviewed by an FBI agent unknowingly and you gave information, you would then be in the record as an FBI informant. That was at the time. I don't know if it's still true. Baldwin was considered a fit subject for FBI surveillance, not only because he was a dangerous individual with an attachment to subversive causes, fair play, which he didn't give a damn about, and because he was given to such statements as, "We must make the establishment afraid of us," but also because of his homosexuality. A memo dated July 7th, 1964, was returned to its sender with a scribbled note from J. Edgar Hoover asking, "Isn't Baldwin a well-known pervert?" A further memo was then prepared, which shows that this remark, which might otherwise have been disregarded as a trivial rhetorical question, was taken seriously. The memo states, "It is not a matter of official record that he is a pervert. However, the theme of homosexuality has figured prominently in 2 of his 3 published novels." The memo writer then proceeds to list certain remarks made by Baldwin on the subject of homosexuality. For example, in Italy, no one ends up going to a psychiatrist and turning into a junkie because he's afraid of being touched. And concludes with impeccable objectivity. While it is not possible to state that he is a pervert, he has expressed a sympathetic viewpoint about homosexuality on several occasions, and a very definite hostility toward the revulsion of the American public regarding it. The FBI had Baldwin marked down as a communist when he was politically independent. They had him married when he wasn't. One snooper claimed to have had a conversation with Mrs. Baldwin, subject's wife. They had him coming from Boston when he was from New York and living at Horatio Street when he lived at Horatio Street. By the time their records had him moving into Horatio Street, he had already moved out. They had him down as a former professor from Howard University. He never taught at any institution, and as author of the novels Go Tell It to the Mountains, that's Go Tell It on the Mountain, and Another World, that's Another Country. And repeatedly, they had him down as a prominent member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee when he scarcely had any interest in it at all. Thus, the entire edifice manifesting the FBI's interest in Baldwin was based on a falsehood.
Absolutely fascinating. The incompetence. I mean, all they needed would be a decent journalist to to have done that research.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he was completely out of the closet. He was kind of very ahead of his time, and he was out of the closet since the mid-50s when he wrote a novel on the subject of a homosexual relationship. So all this kind of hedging around and trying to find out as if they were doing a special investigation, totally unnecessary. Just had to ask him.
Yeah. But to reel it back to the beginning, why did you yourself become interested in Baldwin in the first place enough to write the book?
Well, I suppose it goes back to my time at university. I studied American literature at Edinburgh University in the 70s. And I was what was called a mature student, official designation, I think. I was a little bit older than most of the other students. And I was going in, I specialized in American literature. And one evening I was coming back from my parents' place in Nearden Plain. And I was on the train Sunday evening, I remember it very well. I opened the book, which was one of the texts for the coming week. And it was Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. Gratifyingly short. I remember thinking, oh, good, you know, this is only 110 pages or something. But I was under the impression it was a novel, but it's not. It's a memoir and it's an essay. It's a fabulous book. And I was really struck by it. I can almost remember the feeling of being struck as if, you know, with an arrow through the chest by the force of Baldwin's writing. I really was susceptible to it. And we went from there. I had very good tutors at the university, and lots of discussion. And we went from there to reading others of his works and others of Black American writers. It was again quite a forward-looking course, because we studied Ralph Ellison and we studied Richard Wright, who was a hero of Baldwin and a mentor. And this stuff, I got caught up in it, and I particularly got caught up in Baldwin. And I read absolutely everything I could find by him, not just books, but magazine articles, which hadn't been collected in any book. I went to the Central Library, the National Library of Scotland, and the Central Library just across. Before the days of the internet, of course. And I just read everything I could. And I became a kind of, you know, I was still a student, but I became, in my own little way, an expert on him. And I remember it was the Easter holidays of my final year. It was 1978, the Easter holidays. And everybody went home for the holidays, but I was a bit too old to go home in that way. You know, I went to visit parents. But it wasn't really somewhere I would go for 2 or 3 weeks. So I was still in Edinburgh, and I was feeling rather lonely. And I thought I ought to make some new friends, really. And so I decided to make friends with James Baldwin. And I wrote him a letter telling him what his work had meant to me. And at the end of the letter, I said that I would be thrilled if he would come to Edinburgh and address the students at the university. Well, of course, I was a student myself. I hadn't the faintest idea of, you know, how I would get him to Edinburgh, where I would put him up for the night, what I would feed him with, and how I would pay his plane fare. He lived in the south of France at the time. I was going to pay his plane fare in the south of France, get him back there. I didn't give any thought to any of this. Maybe I thought, nothing would ever come of it. But to my great surprise, I got a reply, and he said, and not from him, but from his assistant, Bernard Sell, whom I later came to know quite well. And it said, Mr. Baldwin would love to come to Edinburgh to address the students. And he would do so between, I think it says, between April 15th and April 18th, on his way to California. Well, you might imagine, this was at one and the same time the greatest thrill of my life, and it was at the same time the greatest catastrophe of my life. What on earth was I going to do with him? And I contacted the person who had given me his address in the first place, in the letter. He was someone who knew Baldwin quite well. He was a filmmaker called Michael Raber. And he said, well, he might just turn up and sleep on your floor. That's the kind of thing he does. So I thought, well, that suits me fine. But as for where was he going to speak? I mean, in those days, there was no funding for this kind of thing. And even if there had been, I was a student. I wouldn't have had access to that. I spoke to one of my tutors and we discussed it. And I don't know, we thought up various things. Anyway, the whole situation was rescued, I think, a couple of days in advance when I got a telegram from Baldwin saying that he wouldn't be able to make it. He had come down with a very bad cold. Could I call him in Saint Paul de Vence to rearrange another date? Oh. Well, I mean, as if things weren't bad enough, the idea of phoning James Baldwin in Saint Paul de Vence really threw me into terror. It was a big deal to make a telephone call to a foreign country in 1968. But I did so, and I did it from a call box. And anyone who's familiar with Edinburgh will know Toll Cross. There was a call box very close to Toll Cross. And one day as I was passing by, I took myself by surprise by almost hustling myself into the phone box and dialing his number. And I had enough change, to get through. And I dialed his number and I got through, and got through to somebody else. And he came to the phone. The person at the other end said, "Who's calling?" And I said, "It's James Campbell from Edinburgh." So he came to the phone and he said, I said, "Well, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?" And he said he was fine. He said he would like to come to Edinburgh again in August.
What was his
When
voice
the festival-
like? Just to interrupt, what was his voice similar to how you imagined, having read all his work, or?
Well, I suppose I had heard recordings of him.
Oh,
He had a very deep. Someone once described it rather nicely as a voice that seemed to have been filtered through honey and brandy.
Yeah.
And with quite a lot of cigarette smoke, giving it tone. So he did speak in that very, very low-slung way.
Yeah.
So he said he would like to come to Edinburgh in August, but I had to tell him that the students would all be on holiday. And so the thing was finished as far as he was very polite. It was lovely. It was a very nice conversation. I came out of that telephone box feeling terrific. I just had a conversation with James Baldwin. I went into the telephone box as Clark Kent, and I came out as Superman. Anyway, that was the end of it as far as he was concerned, but not necessarily as far as I was concerned. Because when I left university in the summer, a couple of months later, I got the editorship of a magazine called the New Edinburgh Review. I became the editor of that. And before very long, a big book came into the office called The Making of Jazz by James Lincoln Collier. So I put it into an envelope and I sent it off to the south of France. And I said to him, you have made many allusions to jazz in your writings, but you've never written a separate essay about jazz. And maybe you would welcome the opportunity to do so. Which wasn't a bad pitch. Anyway, I waited a while. I think I did wait quite a while. I think I'd more or less given up. But then one day I went into the office, which was in Buccleuch Place, and there was a letter from James Baldwin. I mean, I make no attempt to hide the fact that these were major events in my life, to make a phone call.
Yeah, of course.
And to receive a letter from James Baldwin, great things that never happened to me in the past. Anyway, he said he'd love to do a long piece. That's what it said. Would love to do a long piece. It was scribbled in his handwriting. Still got the letter. But can't meet the deadline. That's what it said. Well, of course, there was no deadline. I hadn't said to him, we need this piece by July the 30th, otherwise we can't run it, And I had to call him again in Saint Paul de Vence, which this time I could do from the office at the place. Well, I did, and he was very friendly. He said, "I'd love to do that, baby. I'd love to." Well, this is fantastic, Let's think of anything you like, really. And then I said, there's one thing I really must mention. So this magazine, it doesn't have very much money. And there was a pause. And he said, "Who mentioned money?"
Oh. Because he was notorious. He was I mean, you mentioned in the book several times he was notorious for borrowing money and
He
being a bit
was,
loose with
yeah.
money, but at the same time, a generous man.
Yes, very, very. And so it worked both ways. He was notorious for borrowing, especially in his early life when he was truly broke. But then when he was a star and not broke, it worked the other way. And he said, "Who mentioned money?"
Yeah.
That's a wonderful thing to say. I think we arranged to pay him £80, but I'm not sure the check was even cashed. I don't know. Anyway, this time we did set a deadline. I seem to remember it was early in July. And amazingly enough, I went into the office on that day and there was a telegram again saying that he was going to write a longer piece than he imagined and I should call him again in St. Paul de Vaux, which I did. Each of these calls requiring, several tours of the telephone itself and a lot of kind of calming down. Anyway, I called him. And I said, "Well, it was great." He said, "I'm working on it, baby, I'm working on it." I said, "Well, that's fantastic." He said, "Call me Tuesday." I call him Tuesday. Say, "I'm working on it, baby, I'm working on it. Call me Friday." I call him Friday. And really, I think there was at least half a dozen of these calls. He said, "I'm working on it, baby." So anyway, the New Edinburgh Review was a quarterly magazine. Only came out once every 3 months. And we got everything organized in advance. And I got the cover printed. The cover designer was a fellow called James Hutchison, still in business. And he designed the cover, which I'll just hold up.
Wow.
This is the cover of the New Edinburgh Review with James Baldwin on it. So this was printed in advance of the magazine itself being published. So I called him again, and time was passing. He said, "I'm working on it, baby." I said, "Well, that's great because we've got the cover printed and you're on the front." And he said, honestly, he said, "I'm on the cover?" I said, "Well, of course you're on the cover." He said, "Oh, baby, I better get to work." So I don't think he had been actually doing a great deal all that time, but he sat down and he did.
Wonderful.
And it came through the post, and I got it delivered to my home address in Edinburgh, which was in Forest Road. Even the postman knew about it. I remember the postman knocked on it. He said, "It's here, it's here." And anyway, we printed it, and he was happy. I was happy. And I called him a little bit later on, maybe to ask him where to send some extra copies or something. And he said, and this is really how I came to visit him in the south of France. He said, "I'd like to meet you one day." I said, "Well, I'd very much like to meet you." And he said, "Because you are the most persistent person I have ever known." And I didn't really think I was the most persistent person, but I just thought that when a writer said he was going to write a piece, he went ahead and did it. I've since learned, that that's not necessarily the case, but that's what I had seen. And so he said that any time I happened to be passing by, that was the expression, his St. Paul de Vaux, which is near Nice, he probably said that to lots of people, but not all of them did, but I did.
And so when you finally met him, he comes over from his books. His style is charming. He is a charmer, I think, especially the earlier books. What was he like as a person to meet?
Immensely charming.
Yeah.
Immensely charming. And kind. And kind of like an uncle. I was quite young. I wasn't that young, but I was, under 30. quite unformed. And he was very kind and patient, and he liked the fact. When I went there to St. Paul, when I arrived, I stayed for a week. I didn't really intend to stay for a week, but Bernard Hassel, the assistant, would say to me, I would say I was planning to leave after 2 or 3 days. And Bernard said, why are you leaving? Why do you want to leave? There's a party on Friday night. Jimmy would like you to come. Oh, right. So we would go to a party together in Nice, you know. And at these parties, there was more than one over time. He would introduce me to people as one of my editors. And that was a lovely thing. First of all, it was flattering to me. But it got me out of the position of looking like the latest hanger-on. Because there was a lot of hangers-on in Baldwin.
This comes over in the Mailer interview, where Mailer says, well, earlier in the 60s, he had like a gang, that he was almost like a hood with his gang.
That's right. That's right. He was, in some ways, he was just somebody who couldn't say no. You know, so if somebody affixed themselves to him, or somebody phoned up and said, I'm coming down, as I did, but I was invited. But as I say, probably lots of people were invited, and people said, I'm coming down. He would say, okay, great. Get here. And I was very, very fortunate, because even if there had been 6 other people staying there at his place, he would still have said, great, come down. But on both the occasions, because I went again the following year and stayed for, again, not quite a week, it was just me and him and Bernard and people dropping in. So I was tremendously fortunate, because I had him all to myself, really. And this was it was a kind of dream come true in a way. I remember once, but there were consequences for him in a way. I remember once, it was a afternoon in St. Paul de Rolls, the sun was shining. Lunch usually started at about 3 o'clock and finished at about 4:30. And then after lunch, Baldwin said that he was going to go downstairs to his study, which he called the torture chamber, and do some work. And I can still picture him making typing motions. And I said, well, that's great. I'll go up to the village, which was a quarter of a mile away, and have a beer, and I'll come back later. He said, you're going up to the village? I'll come with you. So as we walked up, I wasn't in a position to tell him what to do. As we walked up to the village, he began to sing a blues. Wow. How long blues? How long has that evening sun been gone? He began to sing. I'm walking up.
And he was a good singer, wasn't he? He had a good voice.
He was a good singer, yeah. He sang a few things. So he began to sing this softly, this How Long Blues. And I thought, here I am in the south of France. I'm walking up to the village to have a drink, and James Baldwin's singing the blues. And it was wonderful. And I mean, I will simply say that I appreciated every single minute of it. I never became blasé. And I saw him later on in London, and eventually he did come to Edinburgh for the 1985 Edinburgh Book Festival. And I interviewed him in Charlotte Square in the tent in front of an audience. So he finally got to Edinburgh, and as it happened, just to finish this off really, it was a wonderful event. And my mother and father came through from Dunblane. And afterwards, when there was a signing session, my father bought a copy of The Fire Next Time and arrived and presented it. Baldwin was, signing away like crazy, and I was sitting beside him. And my father said, that's my son. And he looked at me, Baldwin looked at me, looked back at my dad. He said, he's a beautiful cat.
Brilliant. Was Baldwin...
And then he signed it. He signed it to Harry Campbell, God bless. I've got the book upstairs. But that was a nice...
that was wonderful. I mean,
a nice event.
Was he, that was obviously towards the end of his life. Was he ill at all at that stage, or?
No, he wasn't ill at that stage. The last time I saw him was in April 1987. It was just a few months before he died. He was ill then. That was in London. Although it didn't seem too bad. But no, at those times, I mean, he had phenomenal social stamina.
Right.
Most people slow down a bit, you know. So when it comes to midnight, if you're 65, you kind of look at the clock. Everybody's sitting around the table at the Roxburgh Hotel, as it used to be.
Yeah.
And about to order another round of drinks, but you look at the clock and you think, nearly midnight, I better be getting to bed. But that wasn't the case with him.
Yeah.
It was always another round, always throw another log on the fire. And that's great when it's all happening. And if you, i.e. me, are 30 years old or 35 years old, because you've got that stamina. But he clung on to it, and he would always drink and smoke rather than eat, which isn't so.
Yeah.
He was one of those people who played with his food, you know, and he was very small and bird-like.
Yes.
So there was tremendous social stamina, and always coming out with great remarks all the time. Just one of which I'll say. He was talking, as in the thing that I read there, about how in Italy, he said, people are not afraid to be touched. So somehow or other, that was the topic of conversation. And I remember he came out just in a flash. He said, people fear love more than they fear death. And then I remember he said, this is the kind of thing you were up against all the time, you know.
Sorry, you just blanked out. What was his response after that?
Think about it.
Think about it.
He said,
yeah.
People fear love more than they fear death. Think about it.
Yeah.
And as I say, you were up against this all the time. It was tremendously, it was electrifying.
Yeah.
Electrifying.
Yeah.
But boy, oh boy, you know, you needed your own form of stamina to put up with this all the time. But it was all off the cuff. It was all off the cuff.
I mean, we've sort of, it's been fascinating that we've got to squeeze Norman Mailer now into the picture.
Right? Yeah, of course.
He was another equally fascinating and intelligent person, presumably, to talk to, especially about Baldwin.
Certainly, yes. I think it's fascinating to talk to about just about anything. I know that, for example, Mailer wrote a book about Picasso, which is not a very good book at all. But Melvyn Bragg made a South Bank show about Mailer at the time of the Picasso book, and it is just wonderful. It's one of the most wonderful discussions of Picasso that I've ever seen or heard. But the book is no good, but the talk is, you know, is really superb. So yes, again, it was all kind of impromptu brilliance. And I think that went all through Mailer's life. I met him 2 or 3 times. And I met him while I was writing my book. I phoned up, I was in New York, of course, and I phoned up his house. It's always relatively easy to get people's phone numbers. I can't remember how I got his, but I remember I never had any difficulty getting people's phone numbers. And I called him up, and he suggested we meet in the bar of the Algonquin Hotel.
The famous bar.
At West 44th. And it was very busy. But one of the things I remember was that he kind of knew exactly what we were doing. He knew why he was there. He knew why I was there.
Yeah.
He knew what was expected of him.
Yeah.
It was very kind.
Yeah.
He didn't try any grandstanding. He had some fallings out with Baldwin. But he didn't press that. He just spoke very well and very affectionately. And at the time, I had done lots and lots of interviews, but I didn't make a habit of recording them on a cassette player. But I did record this one. And strangely enough, I don't know why, I didn't make much use of it when I was writing the book. And it was just when this new edition was on the point of being prepared that I remembered about this Mailer interview, which is on a cassette upstairs in the cupboard. And I listened to it, and I thought it was really pretty good. Yeah. By the way, don't believe anyone who tells you that cassettes deteriorate and disintegrate. They don't. It was in perfect condition. It was beautiful. And I transcribed it, and then I put an edited transcript.
And it is fascinating, I have to say, because of both Mailer and Baldwin, both of them have this much more sophisticated and nuanced view of both homosexuality and blackness, which are the two things that he's crudely really known for.
Yes, and very different views.
Yes.
That's not to say that Mailer was in any way prejudiced or bigoted about these things, but he had his own subtlety, let's say, and he came at these things from his own angle, and he had what another writer, Hemingway, called a foolproof bullshit detector.
Yes. Yes.
So he wasn't putting up with anything. Baldwin was a great rhetorician.
Yes.
And made these fabulous speeches. Yeah. And you kind of can imagine Mailer in the audience saying, "Oh, come on.
Yeah.
You know that I know that that's bullshit."
Yeah.
That's just like, there's a little bit of that.
Yeah, yeah. Especially perhaps in the later work of Baldwin, when he takes on a cause that, I mean, you mention it really nicely in a way he damages his own talent to some extent. Well, actually, maybe that's a Mailer comment. He damages his own talent in order to his loyalty to black people and their cause in America causes him to become cruder, really, than he really is.
I think that's true. I think first of all, fame is a very difficult thing to put up with. It damaged Mailer too, in a way. But Mailer, in artistic terms, or in writerly terms, was more of an idealist, and he was aware that he was in possession of this wonderful talent, and that to some extent he had to look after it and nurture it, and also provoke it. So he did outrageous things because he thought, it would prompt him to write something unusual. Baldwin had a horror of being seen to take refuge in the ivory tower. But every writer who wants to get the best out of his own talent has to, at some stage, lock himself away in the ivory tower and say, "Do not disturb. I'm not available." Yeah. And there is this monster called fame at the door. It's knocking on the door, asking for interviews, asking for autographs, basically. It's wanting to be your friend. And if you're a compulsively sociable person, like James Baldwin was, as I say, he was just a boy who couldn't say no. So he would say, "Well, come in." As he said to me, I tried not to disturb him, but sure, come down. So it was it was a blessing. as far as I was concerned. And I hope I was a well-behaved Scottish boy when I was down there. But at the same time, it was a kind of curse. Not my personal presence, but that characteristic.
Yes.
Saying yes to everything.
And yes to the Cuba cause, because they just happened to ask
Yes,
him,
that's
even
right.
if he didn't want to support it particularly. So, I mean, I think it's fantastic that you brought your real experiences to us, rather than just talking about abstract issues. But we are closing on the hour, so perhaps we should ask the audience for some questions and see if they have anything specific they want to ask you. Can we? Is there anyone out there who wants to fire a question? And are there any questions coming through? I think we're all right there. Anybody? Well, I would ask. I mean, I've got lots of questions, but the one I think that comes to mind is he was always ambiguous about his sexuality. I mean, he was obviously homosexual, bisexual, but he never really liked to be tied down. And I think that's the refreshing thing about him and his books.
That's correct. Yes, he didn't like that. He didn't like the gay ghetto. He didn't even like the word gay.
Yes, yeah.
Rather old-fashioned in that way, I suppose. You know, this was all would be in the 60s and 70s. As the gay liberation movement was rising, I suppose his position would be, well, what's new? Yeah. What's new? I've been here for a long time, and he didn't want his position to be politicized. So it was a private matter. He used to say, "I've loved a few men, I've loved a few women." In his youth, he was engaged to be married twice. Yeah. He had girlfriends, but it was mainly men, you know, as he got old. But he just didn't want it to be a mark on his forehead. And even though, you know, he didn't have girlfriends later in life, I wouldn't really know, would I? But he was very attractive to women, and he loved women, and he had lots of women friends, you know, who came round. Because he was funny, he was considerate, and he was kind and intelligent and patient with people, as he was with me. So it was just something he wanted to back away from, this all-male movement, yeah, you know, of homosexuality, where he would be classified in a particular way. He didn't like that. Just as ideally, he wanted to back away from black and white.
Exactly, yes.
Now, there was another wonderful moment, for me anyway, when I was sitting with him in St. Paul de Vence, and he began saying, white people this and white people that. And it was a little bit of a tirade. I must have looked a bit anxious, you know, because I remember he put a hand on my knee and he said, "I'm not talking about you, baby. I'm talking about the people who think they are white."
That's
now that's a wonderful.
It's a wonderful insight, because he also was didn't like the idea of white people appropriating black ways of talking. He always thought it was sort of the beats. You know, he thought there was something a bit phony about appropriation of black culture in that sense.
Yeah, I suppose he did when it seemed to him to be pretentious.
Right.
I don't think he would have had any patience whatsoever for the present-day cultural appropriation shenanigans. You know, there's a big wide world out there.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you make friends with whoever you can find, and you think and speak and imagine whatever you want.
Well, don't you think?
Yes, he did make a little attack on Kerouac, which is quite amusing. It's in the book. Yeah, it seemed a little bit phony to him.
Yeah.
Because this was a kind of impersonation of Black experience, whereas he and his brothers and sisters were experiencing the real thing. So there was a bit of impatience there. But at the same time, he loved Allen Ginsberg. I remember him saying about Ginsberg, he's a beautiful man. He's a beautiful man. So he was very patient, you know.
And he comes across, I mean, we're sort of winding up a bit here now, but there's
Okay.
far less parochial than, you know, many writers, both black and white, who sort of assumed the mantle of articulating, you know, black ideas. You know, he travelled widely. He'd read widely, and I think to some extent it's sad. There seems to be a greater parochialism in America about those subjects.
I think that's true. He lived in Turkey for a while. He lived in Paris for a while, for a decade, and he lived in Saint Paul de Vence for the final decade of life. Mailer criticized him for separating himself from America in that way. But it was, to some extent, it was he would have said, to be able to live.
Yes.
You know, to be free of this racist thing. My own feeling, really, in conclusion, I suppose, is that James Baldwin was a genius. He was born, he says here, that I read at the beginning of the session, I was born dead. Well, he was born a genius. And it's, you know, we often talk about nature or nurture. In his case, it was pure nature. I knew one of his brothers quite well, David Baldwin, and I met other brothers and sisters passingly. And they were not like him. Yeah. Very nice people, but they're not like him. Yeah. And he was tremendously bright when he was a teenager and so on. Yeah. Everybody remarked on it. You couldn't miss it. So in some ways, I feel that when it came to the mid-60s, America became too much for him, and it became too much for his talent. It weighed itself on it, it pressed on it. Yeah. And it kind of didn't smother it, but it kind of pressed the wind out of it. Yeah. Quite a bit of an extent. And you must remember, as he would have said, as he did say, my friends were being assassinated in the meantime. Yeah. Not just Robert Kennedy, who wasn't exactly a friend, but Martin Luther King, yeah. Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers, who was the leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, yeah. Who was assassinated. Yeah. And these were terrible events, terrible events, yeah. Altogether, of course, but in the life of James Baldwin, these were terrible events, yeah. One after the other.
Yeah. No, I mean, we've only touched the surface here, but it is an absolutely fascinating read, because your book, I mean, almost every page, there are lovely insights into both Baldwin and the times, because of course he's a great mirror of the times that he lives through. So yes. It's a really worthwhile read, and I thank you for sharing those experiences with us. It's been really interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me. Oh, sorry. We have one question.
Oh,
yes.
Hello.
Okay.
But he would speak up so loudly. He didn't hide. immense amount of courage. But it's also that if a white guy could influence him and be his friend, there's an opportunity for white people in schools who let black kids down every day.
Okay, so I think that's...
White people can influence and must wake up.
Okay. Well, that's a statement, but I think the question is a very important one. Was one of his greatest attributes courage? Do you think?
Unquestionably. He would not have survived as long as he did without courage.
Yeah.
I think he probably needed courage each time he stepped out the door.
Yeah.
But you couldn't defeat him. You know, if he was willing to take on the FBI, and he did, he was going to write a book about the FBI. He was going to write a book about all sorts of things he didn't write books about. But that was one of his things. Tremendous courage, of course. He was immediately recognized.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've run out of time. And thank you again, James, for spending time with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Bye-bye.